Hello, everyone, wherever in the world you are this week. Welcome to Shapes of Grief. I have another wonderful guest this week, Dorothy Holinger, PhD, who is an academic psychologist, or was an academic psychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School for over 23 years. And Dorothy is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and has her own psychotherapy practice in the USA. I'm holding in my hands her book, The Anatomy of Grief. For anyone watching on YouTube, you can see the cover there. And I want to begin by just reading a paragraph, which is on page 76. 5 went to the hospital, 4 adults and a baby, but only the 4 adults left, carrying the baby's clothes folded inside the bunting. My mother said she didn't hold her baby after she died. It wasn't allowed then. Or maybe she just couldn't. Her shock at the death of my sister crushed her. There was no autopsy. My grandmother ruled against it. And my mother gave in, not realizing that this meant she would never know why her baby died. It was from my aunt, who was there, that many of these family details gradually became known to me over the years. Dorothy, you're so welcome.
Okay. You know, it's interesting as you were reading it, as always, when I go into any of this with regard to my sister's death and my mother's death, I just get all goosebumps and emotional. And I think, you know, after all these years, I mean, she died when I was a year and a half, not quite. And so it's really extraordinary how grief doesn't go away. It comes, it subsides, but any kind of a stimulus, like, of course, words are so powerful, and reading that paragraph is so moving to me. I grew up with my mother never really having grieved her baby. In fact, whenever I would mention my sister, whose name was Elaine, by the way, I learned very early on not to do that very much, because my mother would just go into a place where she was accessible, but she was so very sad. She wouldn't always cry, sometimes, but so in any event, I grew up staying away from that. And the only people who would talk about my sister and her death, like I described in that paragraph, was my family. And they talked about what happened to her and how, well, anyway, let me fast forward. My understanding, given all of my research on the brain, is that what she died of was cerebral meningitis. And I mean, the symptoms fit with what my family had told me. So that really made a huge difference for me to know that that I knew, or at least all the clues point to that.
Those 2 words, cerebral meningitis, the importance of them to finally put words on,
Yes.
On a concept. And you talk about this in your book, actually, the importance of giving a narrative to grief, to the experience, and the importance of words. I'm curious, you know, you went on to do some research on the brain, how this early experience, you were 1.5,
Right.
probably, you know, decided the trajectory of your life.
You know, that's a wonderful point, Liz. I never thought about it that way, but yeah. And you know what else I think figured into that trajectory? I was it drove my mother crazy. I was always asking why, but what? But supposing this, but suppose it. And I think it's really what led me to go into clinical psychology, but with a focus in terms of the research on the brain. And I've done electrophysiology and MRI, as well as in the last work that I did, was measuring neurons in postmortem brains. And that was just, to get answers was always so exciting and satisfying. And, you know, as I'm talking and thinking about this, my mother never knew, because she died before I really figured this out. You know, Liz, I figured it out when I was writing the book. Like one
Wow.
always figures things out. The words, you know, the written word is powerful in a very different way than the spoken word, like what we're doing, speaking back and forth to each other. It pulls you back. I'm trying not to filter, pulls you back to the unconscious that is really just bubbling up, and that's the rich resource that you have for what it is what art you're using to express yourself. And that's what happened. I cried a lot writing this book, and it surprised me. I mean, not that I'm surprised when I cry, because it's easy for me to do that, but it surprised me the places I went that were scary sometimes, but ultimately wonderful. And this brings tears to my eyes, but I've memorialized my sister in this book, and I'm so happy for that, as well as my mother.
You've given Elaine a place.
Yes, yes,
A place
yes,
to be. It's
yeah,
really interesting, Dorothy, because in Ireland, just in the last month, we had a census, you know, where the
yeah,
government puts a form in everyone's home. And this year they put an extra piece in called a time capsule, you know, where you could write whatever you wanted in the time capsule. But so many people put in their Elaines, you know, their
yeah,
babies that had been born in the last 4 years and died in the last
yeah.
4 years, who wouldn't otherwise be in a census anywhere.
True.
And the importance of giving place,
Yeah,
locating our deceased loved ones, giving them somewhere to be, it can be so important for the bereaved. I
yes,
want to segue maybe into part of your book, Dorothy. You talk about grief in the head, grief in the heart, and grief in the body. And you talk about grief in the brain, actually, the grief brain. And you know, you talk there about examining the neurons in post-mortem bodies, which is
yeah.
interesting. Could we move to the brain in grief and what you know
Yes.
about that?
Well, you know, it depends at what point after the death of the loved one the bereaved is at. In the acute phase, when they first hear about it, you know, there's a number of different reactions, and it's the body that really takes over. But when that is lived through with, you know, a funeral service and the burial, etc., and the family leaves and the friends leave, it's then that the brain has to deal with the emptiness. And very often cognition isn't the same, actually a lot, not, you can't remember things like you did. I have a friend who told me about her friend who worked in the library, and she, it was a very sad thing. It was her son who died of a drug overdose, and she came back to the library to work, but she would say to my friend, I can't remember anybody's name. I see their face. Please, when they come in, I'm going to just somehow signal you, and you have to tell me what their name is. And, you know, other times, you know, there is a kind of rare grief that you've talked about actually in one of your podcasts. Used to be called complicated grief and now prolonged grief. By the way, when I first was, as a graduate student, yeah, I was working on the brain too. It was, we were researching that kind of grief, which we didn't really know what it was at that point because it was a long time ago, but it was called pathological grief, which is dreadful.
Yeah.
But in any event, in a wonderful study by Mary Frances O'Connor, she found a place in the brain. Well, maybe you talked about that in the podcast. I didn't hear the whole thing. Pardon?
That's okay. We can go over it again.
Oh, okay. But that part of the brain in the group of women who had complicated, the study called it complicated, now it's prolonged grief, compared to the women who did not have that kind of grief, the reward center was activated. And part of that is not just that it's a reward center. I mean, that's part of it, but it's also because it becomes a habit. It's interesting. I didn't think I was going to be talking about prolonged grief, but I've worked with several patients who had prolonged grief. And, you know, there's a controversy now. I was at a conference yesterday and rather Friday and Saturday, and people are conflicted about that this grief is now put into the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Well, you know, when people have this kind of grief, it is so different than any other kind of grief. And, you know, part of this is financial. If you don't have a diagnosis for it, the insurance doesn't pay for it. So it gets very murky, but I think from my experience that it is a good idea. You know, it's called prolonged grief, and it really only affects about 5% of the people in the US and 2 to 3% in the world, globally. So
I think a lot of the controversy is misunderstanding actually of what we're talking about, because I have seen people who are very prominent in the world of grief just completely misquoting the DSM actually. And I think one of the dangers is when people maybe are psychotherapists and have a significant bereavement themselves, but maybe haven't really researched the you know what's available in grief research. They take their personal experience and make it universal. And if prolonged grief disorder doesn't apply to me, then it doesn't exist. And I'm seeing that, you know, and it's unfortunate that some people have loud voices in the space, but I think I fully agree with you. It is a thing. It absolutely is there. And it's not when grief endures. It's when it endures with a very high volume on it for a very long period of time. It's relentless. It doesn't go away. And you know, I give an example with permission of a couple whose son died, let's say 4 years ago, died suddenly and tragically. And he talks about his son all the time. He carves out little things in memorial to him. He'll go out with his friends and have a drink and talk about his son. He'll go to work and talk about his son over the table at work. And he's processing his grief. There's no problem. He is still grieving. It's 4 years down the line. His son is very much part of his life still, and he's managing with life. His wife, on the other hand, has stopped working, cannot re-engage with her friends, doesn't like to talk about her son, thinks, what if only he wasn't on holidays, if only we'd phoned him sooner, if only he
Yeah.
hadn't made that decision, and she thinks about that constantly. And she
Hmm.
suffers from acute chronic anxiety, like anxiety that's there
Yeah.
all the time. And all her life is about her deceased son 24/7.
Yeah.
There's the
Yeah.
difference. One of them has
Huge.
prolonged grief disorder and one doesn't, but they're still both grieving their child 4 years down the line. Do you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. It's interesting that 4 years down the line, the father is grieving in a way that sounds like he's really working. He's doing grief work, and other people. Oh, yes, I just lost my thought and found it. um, Julian Barnes, in his book, Levels of Life, talks about how it took him 4 years to be able to go into his house, into the front hall, without bursting into tears.
Mm.
And, I mean, that's the other issue when people say, well, how long does it take? It is entirely individual. Some people who have, like, I know a woman who lost her husband very unexpectedly, but she had 4 daughters and a family that she lived very close to. And she was, it took her about a year, and then she fit back into a life, a different life, obviously, living without her husband. But whereas other people, you can't give a number for how long
No,
or what's going to happen. It's
no.
extraordinary.
And it's not the length of time, it's the quality of your grief. If you are
True.
happy 8 years after your loved one has died, if you are content and accepting with the way you grieve, that's fine. It's
Sure.
not like there's psychologists out there going, you and you need to come in here. From my experience, these are people who are out there who find prolonged grief disorder online and go, thank God this is a thing and there's a name for it. And I think
True.
I have this.
Yeah.
And if I have this, then maybe there's help for me. So from my experience, it's for the people out there who are suffering, who
Yeah.
want this. It's not for
Yeah.
everybody who's okay with their grief, or,
Yeah.
it's not for them.
That's a lovely thing you said. They're okay with their grief. And, that's one of the things I talk about when I give talks, which is it's okay to grieve. You need to feel that, because if you're not feeling it, it's going to come out somewhere, in some bodily symptom. For example, I know someone else, an acquaintance, who was telling me, it was after I wrote the book, actually. She said, after my mother died, I just kept eating and eating. Some other people can go in the other direction. She said, and I had no idea what was going on. And she said, finally, I realized 6 months into it, after her mother died, I had no taste. And this is way before COVID. She said, I couldn't taste my food. And she said, once that insight happened, of course, with all of us, and as we as psychologists understand, that insight will also take cognition and emotion and put it together in a way that you then can go forward,
Yeah.
knowing something, feeling something, thinking something that you hadn't gotten onto earlier. Anyway,
Yeah. It's the marriage of the bottom up experience of grief,
yes,
right? Grief in the
yes,
body, and then meaning making, Robert Niemeyer's work, making
yeah,
sense of the physical experience.
yeah,
And then you
yeah,
talk about that in The Anatomy of Grief, the importance of naming something. It
yes,
makes it manageable when we can put words on it. And I guess
yes,
that's what prolonged grief disorder does, that label, while some people cringe at it, for other people, it's, oh, thank you. Someone is naming
yeah.
my experience, which I'm not seeing in other places.
And I think that they changed the word from complicated to prolonged, helps a great deal. It's when you see the word complex or complicated, you think, what? But prolonged, it just gives you an understanding that what you're going through is long, it is prolonged, and it's making your life, for some people, dysfunctional.
Yeah.
Like the woman that you talked about, the mom that's all she does is she's so connected to the death of her child that she can't allow herself to live in ways that she did beforehand.
Yeah, and she's really, really suffering, which is
Yeah,
very different from really, really grieving. But she is really suffering, and I think that's a big difference, prolonged suffering as opposed to still grieving someone years later, which can be a very normative experience. But Dorothy,
exactly.
we've kind of jumped over the brain and we're in the body here. Tell us a little bit more about grief in the body from your research in the book.
Well, funny, I'm going to, if it's okay, jump to the heart, which is in the body.
Yeah.
Okay. That's one of my favorite chapters, because grief again, it's rare for anybody to experience this, but you know how metaphorically we'll say, my heart is breaking. I feel like there's a hole in my heart. Well, there is something called broken heart syndrome that technically is called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And something does happen to the body. The heart, the shock of the death is so intense for some people. And this is about 5%. It usually happens more to women than to men. Although a recent study, let me be able to come back to this, a recent report at Yale said that there were people, young people coming into the emergency room experiencing broken heart syndrome because of COVID and the pandemic and the distress that they've been experiencing. Well, anyway, let me go back to broken heart syndrome. What happens, that bottom part of the heart, the pumping part.
The left ventricle.
Thank you. The left ventricle. That balloons out. And so that bottom part of the heart, with the narrow aorta on the top, looks like a Japanese octopus catching pot. And that's called a takotsubo. And that usually, by the way, most times, and again, we're talking teeny numbers here, things go back to normal. There are no lasting effects. But the phenomenon of that happening to the body, I mean, this is grief expressed. This is grief exploding. Yeah. And I haven't worked with anybody like that, but at all.
In my experience, so many people, when they talk about the pain of grief, and I ask them, where is it? Where do you feel it in your body? They will always put their hand right there.
Heart.
And they will say it's like a tightness here.
Yeah.
It's a tightness here. And it's interesting. I knew that about the Japanese octopus pot. And actually, after the earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand, a few years ago, there was 20 cases or 18 cases of takotsubo reported.
Oh, really?
Yeah, following that huge community disaster. But it's so physical, the experience of grief. It's such a visceral, physical experience.
It is.
We have this going on in the heart. I think the tendons also become quite fragile, the tendons of the heart. But like you say, it's a temporary condition.
Yeah. And
for most people, things go back to normal. But our chances of heart attack, I think it's Matosky et al. Have reported that our chances of heart attack following a significant loss really do increase in the 6 months after a loss.
True. Yeah.
Go ahead, Dorothy.
Well, it just occurred to me as we were talking about how when grief is expressed in the body, Darian Leader, who's written a very nice book, he's a psychoanalyst in London, and he describes a child who lost his father giving. That's why I don't tell jokes, because I always choose what the punchline is first. But in any event, I don't know, he was about 6 or 7, and his mother had a visitor, and the woman said, why is your son sitting in that suitcase? And she said, oh, I don't know, he's just playing. Well, Leader interpreted that as that was the silent way that boy was expressing the last time he saw his father, which was in a coffin. And I thought, boy, was that powerful. You know, children don't have the language we do, but they sometimes can express through what they're doing with their bodies. And so do we, actually. You know, I mean, you know, when you just talked about putting your hand over your heart, when you think about something powerful, something emotional that can also be joyful. We're so connected.
Absolutely. You were mentioning there the brain, and it's in your book as well, The Anatomy of Grief, the changes that happen in the brain. And, you know, you mentioned that woman who couldn't remember anybody's names in the library. And, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, that's something to do with the amygdala swelling, and sort of stopping the flow of blood and oxygen to the prefrontal cortex?
Well, whenever you have an intense emotion, it's the amygdala that responds, first of all, with the neurons that are I was going to say going like gangbusters, but kind of, that's where the activation is, which is subcortical. And a very lovely study that's been quoted a number of times by Matthew Lieberman and his folks showed that, well, let me go into the study a little bit. It was an fMRI study, so people were looking at photos of people that had negative emotions. They were scowling, or they looked angry, or they looked sad. And so the instruction was, describe it, just use a word to describe that. So when they used the words that were negative, that went with the negative expression, what happened was the amygdala, the processing and the activity in the amygdala slowed down, and it went, and the activity, the neuronal activity, went up to the prefrontal cortex on the right side, lateral prefrontal cortex. And that was a way that I think really supports when you put your feelings into words, even though, and before you do that, how overwhelming they feel, it's a way of regulating them. Yeah. So it helps with grief. And I say that in my talks, usually at the end, that, you know, speak your grief, write your grief, paint your grief, garden your grief, anything that you can do that expresses that. And again, I go back to Julian Barnes. It was a very powerful part of his book. He talked about how he went to dinner with some wonderful friends, and he mentioned his wife's name 3 times. Not one of those times did anybody pick up and say, well, how you doing? I'm so sorry you lost Pat. And he said, boy, you know, it reminds us who have Catholic background. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about.
The undercurrents, the unspoken.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Dan Siegel talks about this in his work also, doesn't he? Dan Siegel, the neuroscientist, about the importance of naming our emotions.
Yeah.
Name it to tame it, I think is his
Oh,
expression.
yeah, no, I don't know that. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. Name it to tame. I
Name
love
it to
that.
tame it. And it's like,
It
you know, when
does.
you're talking there about the amygdala shrinking, once we name, I'm terrified, or I'm
Yes.
anxious, or this is making me uncomfortable. Once we can name our
Yeah.
experience, or I feel so sad, or express it with words or with emotion, the amygdala shrinks, and our nervous systems begins to settle, and we're no longer in fight or
Right.
flight mode.
Right. And
So
you know
there's
that
wisdom.
it's neuronal processing that calms down, and the processing where the activity is seen, fMRI, like with that Lieberman study, is up to the right lateral prefrontal cortex. And you know, yes, the amygdala is fight, flight, but there's another one too that people don't usually mention, which is freeze.
Yeah.
Because when animals are frightened, they think they're going to be killed or something, they freeze. And sometimes that happens when we hear about a death. People can't talk. It's like, you know, that there are just different kinds of responses, wailing, denial. And, you know, it's that, that almost severed contact between the brain and the body. You can't talk because something in your world has so profoundly changed that you actually have no words yet to be able. This is in the very beginning, the acute phase. But you don't get over it, but you do process it. You work your grief, and it does change. But another thing that may be helpful to realize is crisis can create growth. I mean, we as clinicians know that. We see how people change, particularly when they're in the midst of a crisis, because everything comes apart. You know, it's if you think of an earthquake in a way, or Humpty Dumpty, but you put your life back together in a way that you go on living, and you can find joy. And as I say in the book also, the lead of grief can be transformed into gold, the gold of joy. It's never without its sadness. It's bittersweet, but you go on with your life, and those images, those memories of the beloved deceased, you see them, and you know, it makes you chuckle sometimes with some silly thing that happened, or some and it makes you cry sometimes. But
I think, you know, we talk about post-traumatic growth in option B, or
yeah,
you know, this psychological growth that can happen after loss. And I think it's there if the individual wants it. You know, it's part of our meaning making, isn't it? It's,
yes,
you know, well,
yes,
this is how I'm going to find my place in the world now, by making it mean this. And some people don't want that. They just don't
right.
want that. So it doesn't happen for everyone, but it happens. It's there, available for some people, should they choose it. But it is like, if we were to suggest, oh, maybe you'll be a better person, or you'll grow from this, we'd probably get a slap. And rightly so, rightly so. But it's when the individual themselves says, you know what, I prefer who I am. I wish they weren't dead. I
Yeah,
would give up this new, better version of me in a flash to have them back. But it's part of the meaning making, I think, isn't it?
yeah. And you know, that leads me to say that the person that you were with a loved one who died, there's no longer that person, because
Yes.
who you were was interacting with that loved one. And you become, as you say, you find meaning, you become somebody new without them. And and to go back to the brain, there are those neurons that were activated, that began processing when you were with your loved one. I think I use the example in the book of a woman at a beach with a baby, her toddler on her hip, and she sees her husband or partner in the water, and they wave to each other. That's not going to happen anymore if that partner dies. And it may be something here too about the length of time. It's as though for many people, and I think this is part of the Jewish tradition with sitting Shiva and going through a year of all of the holidays, all of the seasons that we lived with them, and you mark that intellectually, cognitively, emotionally, and physically too. You're not there with your loved one, and you go through all of those seasons without them. And it's dreadfully sad. It hurts. But then the next season, although, I have a very dear friend and colleague who's actually, it was her husband who pointed out Ariel in The Tempest, where I quote toward the end of the book, because anyway, he pointed me out to that. And we had dinner with her the other night, and she said, the second year, it seems harder for me than the first year, because the first year there was some part of me thinking he'll come back. And I mean, this is a brilliant neuroscientist who, she knows the brain, and she just started to cry a little bit and said the second year at times is more difficult than the first. On the other hand, or in addition, she has her work, and that has sustained her. And I, actually for a long time, she and I talked every other week. But is it okay? I'd like to mention where that sea change came from. Okay, this was a woman. This was a woman who came into therapy a number of years ago, and she was a retired professional, fabulously successful career. And so in the intake interview, she just, as we were going through, as she was answering the questions, she said, "Oh, I had a pregnancy," because I think it was, "What, do you have any children?" "Oh, I had a pregnancy." And then she moved right on, which I thought was curious. And later during the therapy, whenever anything came up, which was very rare, she'd still refer to it as a pregnancy. Whenever I tried to push a bit, sometimes not so much a bit, she just said, "I don't want to talk about it. It was a pregnancy. That's all I have to say." So, but one day she came in, and Liz, it was around the anniversary, she said, "I had a baby who died. She died 10 minutes after she was born." And her saying baby, as I say in the book, and as my friend's husband, who was our friend, George, said, it was a sea change. It was different. She was able to access grief that she couldn't touch for I don't even want to tell you how many years, but she was finally able to do that, and did. And we talked about, who that baby was a baby girl, who that baby girl might have become, what her life was like. Anyway, it was, you know, I think you and I both are in awe of some of the work our patients do and how they change. And it's a privilege to work with people.
It is, absolutely. It's amazing, Dorothy, how grief can be so unresolved for so long.
Yes.
And, you know, I've had similar situations where women, and several, more than one hand I could count, have come because someone they love has died. But actually, the grief that it really
Yes.
uncovers is the baby that died
Yes.
30, 40, 50 years ago.
Exactly.
And just like the paragraph I read out at the beginning of our conversation, they were never able to hold that baby. They
Right.
thought they were bringing the baby to get healed in the hospital, and
Yes.
that that's so common for women of a certain generation. The
Yeah.
grief that they had to bear without ever really experiencing fully the depth of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I had another patient that I do write about in the book also. She came in, she was referred to me for depression, and it was interesting very early on in this therapy. Let me back up. She thought she was depressed because she had just retired. She was in her mid-50s. And but very early on, she and I realized that she came in because of the grief she had never experienced for the baby that she had lost, that I call baby Angela. And she wasn't able to access that grief because she got pregnant very quickly after the death of Angela. And so her life was just nonstop. She had a boy, and she went back to work when the boy went to school. And I mean, it was just a very, very full life. And she loved her job. But it was when she retired that it gave her the opportunity and the time and the space and the safety to be able to explore this. And my goodness, part of that exploration was the trauma that she experienced, because Angela was born with a cardiac defect and had a number of surgeries that were just, as the patient described them, awful. And she'd, you know, go to the hospital and hold Angela and rock her. But the way she hurt, and so that, but then she'd bring the baby home and the baby would have to go back. But how she heard about the death was over the phone, 2:00 in the morning. And she said, I just threw the phone on the floor and I just screamed, no. But then, you know, she got dressed, she and her husband, and they went to the hospital. But she, interestingly enough, after grieving for quite some time in the therapy, she went back to her art because she was an art major in college, and sent me a photo, texted me a photo of a painting she did of a ladder going up to her window because she was isolated because of the pandemic. It was very funny. Anyway, but the work that she did was amazing.
And back to your point earlier, a point which I often make as well, the need to express, sing, write, garden our grief, but find some way to express our grief, either through words or tears or
Yeah.
products, whatever way it is, or sweat. Dorothy, I'd love to go back to your chapter 2 of your book, which is
Oh, yeah.
forms of grief, and how that neatly slots into shapes of grief, which you commented on before
Yeah.
we started recording today. You know, the reason I chose the name Shapes of Grief
Yeah.
really to highlight that there's so many different losses that we can experience in life, and so many ways we can grieve those losses. And
Yeah.
you've picked up on that as well in your book, chapter 2, Forms of Grief. Would you
Mhm.
speak to us a little bit about that chapter, please?
Sure. I'm going to read a little bit of it, but that many of us know, I think many of your audience too know, that there are forms of grief that they experience, like anticipatory grief, which is when family members experience that a loved one is terminally ill and anticipating that they're going to die. And there's a kind of grief that they experience then. And that was, by the way, also experienced during the pandemic, when family members didn't know if a hospitalized loved one was going to die. And then there's ambiguous grief. By the way, anticipatory grief that term came from during the First World War, Second World War rather. Eric Lindemann from Boston. There was the Coconut Grove fire, and also men were going into the military and never knowing whether they were going to come back. So ambiguous grief, that's when a loved one goes missing and they're presumed dead, but there's no deceased body. So there's none of that ability to be able to process, to see the person that just died at the funeral home, to bury them or sitting shiva. But with that kind of a grief, there's always a shred of hope that the loved one will turn up somewhere, somehow.
Yeah. And that's the work of Dr. Pauline Boss.
Yes, exactly. And then there's forbidden grief, which really affects children. And this is, I had actually two patients who experienced this. One is a child, one is an adult. When the primary griever doesn't want to talk about the death and will say, that's it, the funeral's over, he or she is buried, I don't want to talk about it. Please don't ever mention it again. I mean, it's hard for us to embrace that, to be able to understand that, but the death is so grievous for that bereaved that they don't want to talk about it. And then there's disenfranchised grief. This is the grief that siblings feel, when they don't want to take center stage because it's the primary grievers, the parents, who really are the focus. And sometimes, the sibling doesn't feel like they have a right to, they have permission. And that, I think, is Kenneth Duca.
Yeah.
Duca, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or sometimes in the case of miscarriage as well.
Yeah.
If, society doesn't really recognize the laws.
True.
Or with
It's true.
same-sex partners, where people may not acknowledge, I mean, it's so different now, thank God, but it still has a long way to go. But when people don't acknowledge the relationship and therefore don't really acknowledge the loss. I think I first spotted that when a woman said, oh, you think it's bad when your husband dies? Try when your ex-husband dies. And no one acknowledges that could be a thing for the griever.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that puts us into postponed or delayed grief. The woman that I talked about, whose baby Angela died, I mean, she really had postponed or delayed grief. It didn't interfere much with her life. It did at times, but not in the way that the woman who couldn't mention the word baby. It was really quite different. And this also happened during the pandemic for people. I had a patient whose sister died, not of COVID, actually. And she said, Dr. Holinger, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't feel anything. I feel numb. Yeah. And we talked about how, in fact, they did have a mass recently for the sister, how there would be a time, we hoped, when she'd be able to access that grief. And she did. And then there's just two other, there are more in the chapter, but two others I do want to mention. Chronic grief, that's a continuing hum in the background. That's what my mother, I think, experienced, because she just stop and not cry, but almost. And I could see that she never really got over my sister's death. And
She never integrated the baby's
no,
death. Yeah.
she didn't. Yeah, yeah,
We'd expect people not to get over, I guess, but yeah, it
true.
never became manageable or integrated.
It's
Yeah.
interesting what you said, integrated. I use the words never got over, and I don't ever use those words. And I think it's because I remember my aunts saying to my mother here or there, Mary, you've got to get over this.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm echoing what they said, and I'm shocked.
Well,
Anyway,
I wanted to say it because I suspect from knowing your book, I know that you understand that, but
yeah,
it's exactly that. It's this narrative we hear in society all the time. They'll never get over that.
yeah,
I
yeah.
said today, I did another interview earlier, and I talked about someone passing away. I never say that.
I know
They
I
died.
don't
They're dead. They died.
either.
But
Right.
I found myself pulled into what we were talking about, the culture of the time where
Yeah.
people pass away because we don't talk about death. So it's easy to happen when we're in a certain mode.
Yeah. And I guess, yes, exactly. The mode that you're in, the interaction that you're having with that person. And I guess I was pulled back to the time, what my family would say to my mother.
Yeah.
Um, and then the last one I do want to mention, which is so powerful for all of us now, collective grief. The grief experienced on a national or global level when a national disaster like COVID-19, it resulted in just about 1 million deaths in the US, but many more millions in the internationally. And of course, the tragedy of this awful war that's going on in Ukraine, thousands of deaths and millions, I don't know the number of women and children leaving the country. It's just awful. And
I
we're
have
all
two of
feeling
them
that.
living here with me, Dorothy.
You
Um,
do.
I have two young Ukrainian women here.
Oh,
They're not women; they're teenagers, really. Um,
oh, Liz.
and for the last few weeks, it's like they're here on a bit of an adventure, and I've been helping them get a job, and they're a bit excited and giggly and talking to their friends at night. um, but then last weekend Odessa was hit, the town they're from, and
Oh,
I believe there was 8 people killed. They knew a young couple that were killed in that missile attack. So their experience completely changed. And
oh,
even just before I came on to you, I was down in the kitchen doing the washing up because that's what I do. And, one of them was on the phone to her mom, and it was all in Ukrainian they were speaking, but I could tell from the tone
tone of voice.
that something was not okay. And, I just made a cup of tea and left it on the table and came and sat down. And when she'd finished the call, which seemed to end abruptly, and it's their families trying to decide, do we get out of here? The Russians are closer to Odessa now. Do we stay? Do we go? We don't want to go, but we have to protect our elders and our youth, and it's just an impossible situation.
It is. It's
And
impossible.
it's here in my living room.
Oh, it's amazing that you're doing that, Liz. How marvelous.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm someone who I have to act, there's no point saying how terrible it all is and then doing nothing.
Yeah.
It feels good to at least be doing my little bit. Um, and as my 12-year-old said yesterday, I asked him, how do you feel? Because this might be on an ongoing basis. It could be for a year. And how do you feel about sharing our home? And he just looked at me and he said, it's the right thing to do. And, you know, they're really nice. Yeah. But the collective grief, it's so present, isn't it,
Yeah.
Dorothy? You
Yeah.
know, from climate grief to pandemic
Yes.
grief to war to almost a grief over humanity.
Yeah.
You know, I know certainly when I was growing up and we looked at the atrocities of World War II and we
Yeah.
thought, God, that wasn't that long ago. How did we let that happen? With all that we know, how did we let that happen in the 1940s? Little did we know that this could happen again.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's where that collective grief that we're feeling about the war is, we're stunned. But, you know, day after day, all of the photos in the New York Times, and it's almost impossible to process.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like grief as well, isn't it?
Yes, it
Where
is.
we have this notion as humanity that we're evolving to
Yeah.
some sort of finite evolved enlightenment or light being or something, but our humanity is more cyclical. We do tend to repeat mistakes again and again. And you know, with grief, it's also cyclical, it's not linear.
True.
Um,
It is.
you know,
It
now the
is.
cycles can lose their potency maybe as we move forward
Yeah.
with our grief. They become less stingy, and you know, there's more space around them and more room for other things. But um grief never leaves us, and
No,
maybe the atrocities of being human never leave us either. It's a curious one. Will there
it
always
is.
be a Putin and a Trump for every
Exactly.
generation?
Exactly. And it's, and you know, somehow the words, you know, if you don't know history, you repeat it, but then that can just be ignored.
So
Ah,
back to your book, Dorothy, The Anatomy of Grief. What was your hope in writing this book?
for people to know that grief affects the human self, that it's okay, to give them permission to grieve, to feel their grief, not for it to overpower them in ways that they didn't know about. I hope that there were, you know, like I do talk about physiology of grief, the evolutionary origins of grief, and then talk about how grief is different for whoever it is that you've lost, like a mother, a father, a child, a sibling, or a partner, a significant other, a spouse, and to know, to have the, I guess, to give the bereaved the knowledge of what's happening, so that instead of, oh my God, what's happening to me? I feel like I'm going crazy. I can't sleep. I can't eat, etc. Those questions will be answered. This is what's happening. Your sleep is affected. You can't think clearly. You don't feel well. You don't have the energy that you had. That to give people the knowledge that it's okay and it will subside, won't go away, and we don't know how long it will take to calm down. But there will be times when it will bubble up again in ways that you think, oh my God, I thought I was not feeling this like this anymore. And it does, and that it's okay. And always to be able to use words. When people don't want to talk about your loss, well, of course, it depends where you are. You have to take that into consideration. But, and you know, you might preface that with, I mean, people might preface it with, this may upset you, but it's really helpful for me to talk about. I lost my loved one, whoever that was. And it's really helpful for me to talk about it. Words, knowledge. Knowledge dispels mystery. You get answers. Sometimes people get annoyed because you ask too many questions, but and I guess I hope. And then the very last chapter that I call Bittersweet Alchemy, when I suggest and hope and have seen that the leaden grief that you've felt can be transformed into the gold of the joy that you feel when you remember your loved one. Always bittersweet, but there is a change. And what you will do with that, knowing that you've changed, with that knowledge, you know, in one of the research studies that I studied, it was Williams syndrome, and the parents called because that was where the postmortem work was. And so a father called and said he and his wife wanted to donate their son's brain. He had just died of a heart attack, which is part of what can happen in Williams syndrome, stenosis of the heart. And he said at the end, after he talked about the son quite a lot, when I called back and got details, we talked for quite a long time. He said, you know, I think this will really help my wife and me, because we know that we're donating his brain, and this is for research that will help other people. And something like, and also like what you're doing, Liz, taking in these two children, really. What can we do? What can you do for yourself? What can you do to remember that? I've talked too long.
Not at all. Not at all. Well, it's the alchemy that you're talking about at the end of your book, isn't it? You know, there's very little we can do about certain things happening, but how we respond to them is entirely in our hands.
It's true.
And I cannot stop Putin's war, but I can certainly give my spare bedroom over. You know, like, you know, we can't stop grieving in the world or experiencing loss, but we can write books about our experience so that the people coming behind us have a little bit more of a manual than we had, you know, or I think that's the motivation for everybody who shares their story on a podcast like this. It's to leave something useful behind rather than just the suffering of it all.
Yes. And you know, I do want to mention that the book is coming out in paperback this month, May 17th. So anyway, just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, super. And I'll just read it out there. It's called The Anatomy of Grief by Dorothy Holinger, and it's published by Yale University Press. And it's a lovely manual. It feels gorgeous in the hand, actually. And I'm delighted we finally got to talk, Dorothy.
Yes, I am
Such
too.
a pleasure.
Oh, it was wonderful to talk with you. Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, and so much there. But I think, like always, we could talk for hours and still talk for hours. But for people listening, they maybe will hear, oh, disenfranchised grief, Ken Doka, what's that about? And they'll do a little Google and it'll lead them, you know, to find something really helpful to them. We covered quite a lot there on prolonged grief disorder and grief in the body, and lots of research as well. It would be lovely to speak with you again.
Oh, I'd love to.
Maybe we can plan that in a couple of months down the line.
Okay, sure.
When your paperback is out as part
of.
Oh,
sure. Okay, that sounds wonderful. Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you everyone who's listening.
Thanks so much, Dorothy.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.